Welcome. Today we're talking about CBS Knowledge Standards 7 through 15. So to date, we have done a little bit deeper dive into Knowledge Standards 1 through 6, and 7 through 15 are also important, but they're quite broad in scope, and it would take a long time to dig into them quite deeply. So what I want to do today is just quickly introduce you to the key ideas in each standard, give you some idea of where you might want to read next to understand kind of what is going on in the CBS community. So Knowledge Standard 7 is knowledge of the principles of functional analysis and functional assessment as applied to psychological health, well-being, and adaptive or maladaptive behavior. So here I would say the world is our oyster. So we are interested in both psychological suffering and psychological flourishing, the kind that would show up in the clinic space. But we're also interested in other things beyond that, interested in helping groups, helping people get along in organizational climates, also helping, folks achieve, kind of even better peak performance. So in the case of like sports performance, helping elite athletes improve, right? The idea of functional contextualism and sort of the aim of CBS, right, to have a science adequate to the human condition means that we really can apply this anywhere that there is the human condition. What we probably need to watch out for as we do that is a lot of those areas have been covered, or there's work been done by folks maybe working from a different worldview, often mechanistic, maybe organismic as well. Um, and so we need to keep our functional contextual roots in place as we consider those other areas. So briefly, that would sort of remind us that mechanistically, we might see people really focusing on decomposing the system into the different parts and trying to understand the forces that govern those parts. They'd be really interested maybe in the hypothetical deductive conclusions, um, pretty topographic definitions of behavior, and we might see concepts coming in that are sort of high level or folk psychology terms. So I use this image of the rabbit duck illusion to sort of say the the material is the same, but it might look quite different as we venture into that particular area and bring the functional contextual perspective, right, where we're going to be emphasizing the root metaphor of the act and context. Our truth criterion is going to be focusing on prediction and influence together. We really want clinical utility. We want to find things that are useful, that have pragmatic value, um, and that we are really going to emphasize more the function over the form of things. So less focused on specifically topographically defined things. Now, getting a deep understanding of functional assessment or functional analysis can take a long time. There's books and courses. You can spend a lot of time getting good at this. So just want to introduce you to some of the kind of big picture things to think about here. This comes from a different Stephen Haynes, who's written a lot about behavioral psychology. And behavioral psychology it predates ACT and is bigger than ACT, but ACT inherits a lot of this and puts a slightly different twist on this. But the basic idea of functional assessment is pretty similar. So you'll see that functionally, some of the things that we really want to pay attention to are identifying the client's behavior problems or goals, really understanding the history and the magnitude and the impact of those behaviors. We want to think about the relationships among those behavior problems. So, not thinking that we can necessarily isolate just one behavior, but we might need to think about the larger links in the system. And we want to try to identify those important causal variables, aka the variables that allow us to do prediction and influence. So we need to look at the contemporaneous social, environmental, as well as those private event, antecedent, and consequential variables. And we might need to use multiple kinds of methods to do that. And we might need methods that really think about or can identify these kind of reciprocal back and forth bidirectional interactions among those variables. A couple other principles. Number 6, modifiability. is also really important. We recognize that history is really important in contextual behavioral science, but we also recognize that history varies in how sort of modifiable, accessible it is to us. So the example here is for folks that have experienced a physical trauma, the physical trauma experience is not highly modifiable. We can't go back in time and have them not have gone through that as much as we would like that. But how they are responding to that or the downstream effects of that trauma on their current life, those might be more modifiable variables. And so we might look at things that we can do now to minimize or work with the unmodifiable part of their history. Again, we want to look at the relationship between those causal variables, the prediction and influence variables, and the behavior problems. And we want to try to get towards what are called here sort of mechanisms. We'll see this later, kind of replacing mechanisms with behavior change processes. So an example from this same 1997 paper, um, they describe how they did a functional analytic clinical case model of a client, and here they describe it as a woman who was referred for treatment to help with headaches and sleep problems. She was pregnant, and they want a non-pharmacological intervention. And what they did here is 2 sessions. So they did 2 sessions of kind of a variety of things, but kind of unstructured interview, some structured interview, some observation, some homework, speaking with collaterals, and they also added in some standardized psychometric measures of like depression. And they put all of that together over the 2 sessions, and they estimate uh, this basically case conceptualization of what is going on, what is driving these two problems that brought the person to treatment. And we won't go into a lot of detail about unpacking this particular network, but I wanted you to see what they look like, to see how we are linking different aspects of things that might be called symptoms. We're looking at the link between like worry and sleep and headache. We've got factors like marital distress in the mix. And you'll see also that modifiability, the letter M. So things like neurological factors in pregnancy, not modifiable in the intervention. But other aspects of what is going on in the network might be more modifiable. So this attention for pain behaviors um, i- is considered kind of highly modifiable. So that might be a place where we might do intervention. But as we start to think about intervention here, we would look at the network and think, um, you know, where might we start? Where might we have the most influence positively on the network? Where might we have the best success? And where might the client want to start? So we put all that together. But I really wanted to just kind of contrast this with what we might think of as like a standard biopsychosocial assessment in mental health, where we'd have kind of a long intake. We get a lot of demographic information, some narrative description of the problem, and then a treatment plan. We aren't really thinking about how these things are linked in kind of causal or reciprocal ways. And so if we take this functional approach, we really can get a stronger sense of what we think is going on in the network and stronger hypotheses about where we should start and what kind of treatment interventions we want to do. Obviously, a lot has changed in the 30 years, and there are new kind of fancier ways to think about this and do this that we'll talk about a little bit. But ultimately, this is kind of the same principles that we're bringing into even kind of current understandings of when we do functional assessment. We want to think about how do we link these things in ways that are clear, where we can see prediction and influence, and that help guide treatment decisions. So from that paper, I just wanted to give you a sample of the some of the assessment methods that were noted in the literature, kind of in the through the late 90s. A lot of systematic observation of clients in their ecologically valid contexts, kids in schools, things like that. Structured observations, role playing questionnaires, some space for self report from clinicians, and um, SUDs and other kinds of psychometric measures. But really, you can see this is pretty heavily focused on like behavioral observation, those things that really help us kind of get a sense of that sort of antecedent behavior consequence thing that aren't captured in sort of one time, snapshots that we see maybe in traditional psychometric measures. All right, now knowledge standard 8, which is understanding of mid-level terms, um, and some examples in psychological flexibility and other some of the other CBS therapy. So we'll kind of walk through this longer definition. So when we talk about kinds of terms, there's basically three levels that we might care about. So high level, those are the ones that usually refer to more of those like folk psychology things that might be more mentalistically defined. So things like attention, anxiety, motivation, trauma. We might also be interested in those basic or low level terms. So these would be like technically precise terms derived from or used in research. So examples would be like from behavior analysis, stimulus control, reinforcement of clinically relevant behavior, motivating operations. And then mid-level is in, as it says, in kind of in between those two. That these are theory-specific terms, but they're not technical, and they're meant to have high clinical utility. So they're meant to be quite useful to clinicians in a lot of different settings. So examples of this would be the ACT processes like acceptance, diffusion. From FAP, we have awareness, courage, and love. There's been some pretty active controversy in the CBS community about mid-level terms. It seems to have quieted down in the last few years, but it has been pretty active in the past. Um, so the argument and support, why do we have mid-level terms? How are they useful? Kind of two ideas. One is that they are thought to represent a collection of functional analyses, right? So this idea that like if you were to work with, the private events of like thoughts, typically, it would be it, idiosyncratic, right? Each person would have different thoughts that they struggled with, and the ways that they interacted with those thoughts could be different. But that if you um, kind of pooled your analysis of working with this thought from a very kind of basic level over many, many clients, what you would see is a similar kind of functional process, right? Where people can be fused with thoughts and then, doing something that we would call um, in mid-level term diffusion. Diffusion is useful and it has a certain kind of functional impact when you do diffusion. And so therefore, diffusion then represents a class of behaviors that have the similar functions in specific contexts. So we can talk about diffusion as a kind of a collection of functional analysis, like a common thing that happens for many people when they interact with thoughts or other verbal stimuli, right? The other advantage potentially of mid-level terms is that they're useful in everyday kind of clinical use. So when we're conceptualizing and communicating with our peers about treatment, so when we're talking about clients and conceptualizing them, it could be quite hard to have a perfectly precise definition. It might be hard to assume that people would know what you're saying about kind of motivating operations and stimulus control, right? Um, delayed discount responding, these kinds of things. So to make this more accessible to the community, mid-level terms are meant to kind of usefully point to these functional analyses, but not require us to use or necessarily understand all of the basic um, terms that might be underlying those mid-level terms. So the criticisms then are that they are kind of imprecise and they might not support the functional contextual criterion of prediction and influence, right? They can be kind of slippery. And one of the risks I think that people are worried about is especially for people that are not coming from kind of a behavioral analytic background and maybe aren't getting kind of heavy doses of that early on. We kind of hope that they get excited about ACT and other CBS technologies, and then do the work to kind of ground themselves in behavioral analysis if they haven't started there. But there's a risk that people can just kind of grab onto these terms and then easily slip into kind of mentalistic thinking or just topographic application, right? Taking diffusion and just sort of using it topographically across clients, not really remembering that they're meant to do this from a functional contextual perspective. The other criticism of these mid-level terms is that sometimes it can be hard to know if we are talking about sort of the process, the procedure, or the outcome. So when we talk about diffusion, are we talking about the process of people, sort of having fusion and then changing to a, this state of diffusion through a process? Is it the procedure? Here's the method of diffusion. So right, using like the word repetition, or I'm having the thought that that's the procedure that we're doing to kind of operationalize the process of diffusion. And then there's the outcome. In other words, we sometimes talk about like the client is fused with this thought, and then I did this thing, and now they're defused. And now we're talking about diffusion as kind of an outcome. And so it can be easily kind of to confuse those things and make it hard to sort of know what exactly are we pointing to when we say diffusion. So I would say in general, those fights I think are still in the field. But I think generally now, people are more thinking that they're clinically useful, and we should just be aware of the limitations of mid-level terms and use them to the extent that they are pragmatically helpful. On the other side, so I think that those are the problems of folks that are coming from kind of a non-behavior background. On the other side, we've seen a recent paper that talks about some of the problems of folks coming from that highly behavioral side when we introduce these kind of pseudo-precise terms. So this is a paper from Mark Dixon's group, specifically talking to behavior analysts, asking them to weigh in and judge kind of how behavior analytic um, different kind of groups of terms were. And so what they did, you'll see some standard ABA terms here: counter control, ratio schedule, negative reinforcement. These are well established concepts in behavior analysis. They showed them some of those terms. They also showed them some pseudo ABA terms. So they made up terms and definitions that sound kind of similar, or they sound ABA-ish in their level of kind of technicality. They also presented these ACT terms. So this is their kind of behavioral analytic operationalization of ACT terms. So just as an aside, also, I would say if you're someone who sometimes gets a bit fuzzy on what exactly we meaning by some of these mid-level terms in the ACT hexaflex, um, I would turn to these definitions a little bit. So think about like present moment awareness there as increasing stimulus control to physical objects in the environment and weakening of stimulus control to the derived or substituted functions of the objects. I think that's kind of a clear way to think about what it is we are meaning when we try to do present moment work, and what it means to successfully do it. So it's kind of a functional definition of what it is that we're trying to do when we do present moment focus. Anyway, so they got these behavior analytic terms for ACT, and then they have these high-level psychological terms, things that are pretty far away from behavior analysis. So theory of mind, depression, anxiety, trauma, addiction, bias. Okay, so then they show them these terms, and they ask them in a couple different ways to give their rating of kind of how behavior analytic these are. And these are behavior analytic folks, different levels of experience and certification. And they do a good job on the left. So the classic ABA terms, they write them like very high as ABA terms, so they got it. And those high level psychological terms that are pretty far from behavior analysis on the right, those are rated low, so they're doing a good job there. And so in the third one is the ACT one. So the ACT is rated a little bit higher than the psychological terms, but a little bit lower than the behavior analytic terms. And so one interpretation of this could be that the ACT terms are not particularly behavior analytic, and that they really are kind of more in that traditional kind of mentalistic psychology vein. But one thing that this study shows that challenges that idea is that these folks rated the pseudo ABA terms higher than the ACT terms, not quite as high as ABA. So what it suggests is, at least for these folks, they sort of said, hey, the stuff that sounds like it's ABA because it's real precise, that's ABA. And the stuff that's ACT-y, that's not written super precise in the way that I expect. So that's not ABA. And so they might be making kind of more of a topographic read of what's happening with these terms, and missing the kind of spirit of this, that the spirit of ACT might be pretty consistent with traditional ABA. And certainly pseudo ABA terms should be rated lower. So that is something to think about for the more behavior analytic oriented folks. Is are they really getting to those functional properties, and judging ACT on that, not so much on its topographic similarity to terms that they already know. So some examples of mid-level terms. When we think about the ACT processes, most people think about the ACT hexaflex, so the 6 processes organized around that. Those 6 processes are mid-level terms: acceptance, diffusions, self as context, those kinds of things. On the left, you'll see another kind of mid-level organization of those terms. So what we often do is use the left part of the hexaflex, acceptance and diffusion. We call that the openness pillar. Uh, we would take the middle, the hexaflex, attention to the present moment, and self as context, and call that the awareness pillar, and then take values and committed action together and think of that as the engaged pillar. So one way to think about that is we could talk about clinical work without using the 6 processes. We could talk about the 3 pillars of openness, awareness, and engagedness for clients. In FAP, there is the awareness, courage, love model. Just giving a picture of what this looks like. And this has also been somewhat controversial in the FAP literature. So some folks have wanted to stay close to the original formulation of FAP in terms of clinically relevant behavior, and then using behavioral principles like reinforcement and punishment. And so there's some folks that do interpersonal behavior therapy, and they're saying that that is really staying close to the behavior analytic roots of FAP, because they don't think the mid-level terms of awareness, courage, love are useful. Other folks are comfortable with awareness, courage, love. They think that it is useful, and that it also maybe is more accessible for more folks to kind of learn and start using FAP. And then on the right, we've got DNAV, which is an ACT and positive psychology, really meant for young people, teens. So using some of the same principles of ACT, but not using any of the terms from the hexaflex. Here we've got this broken out. So the discoverer is really kind of more contingency-based learning, kind of trial and error learning. We have the advisor, which is more of that kind of rule-governed behavior, sort of thoughts and rules that we want to follow. And then the noticer being kind of that awareness, that ability to step back and take perspective and pause. And in the model, we're kind of playing around with those 3 kind of main ways of relating to the world, all guided by values. So vitality or values of figuring out what the person is trying to do in their context. So putting those all together, kind of another way to do ACT, and those terms themselves are also mid-level terms. So part of the knowledge standard talks about how clinical tools also can basically operationalize some of these mid-level models and almost function like models themselves. And then the call here is to recognize that when we do this, we want to make sure that these are grounded in CBS models and principles. So I'll give you an example here. This is choice point model on the left. You can see on the left, it's pretty easy to introduce the choice point, but there is a risk, right? I mean, you can find this on the web, and there's folks that maybe aren't that familiar with the contextual principles of CBS. And so they could take this and they might find it useful, and they could use it in topographic ways. And the ways that they work with the choice point might not be very consistent with sort of the ACT approach or the contextual approach. And so we want to watch for that. Showing on the right, kind of more of an expanded version, same choice point, But giving an example of the kinds of questions that might be helpful to point to those underlying functional principles. So identifying those challenges, talking about sort of like what it move, what it's like, what do you do when you're sort of hooked? So talking about the influence of thoughts, but not necessarily thinking about thoughts or feelings as kind of literal causes, as we might see in other models. So some of those prompts help us make sure that we're using the model in more consistently functional contextual ways. Knowledge Standard 9, Understanding with Critical Reflection on the Positioning of CBS-Aligned Therapies Within Evolution Science and the Principles of the Extended Evolutionary Meta-Model as a Model of Models. Okay, so throughout behavior analysis and CBS, there's always been a focus on evolution. Part of this is, I think, a recognition of the influence of evolution as a successful scientific model. So this quote from Dobzhansky, that nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So evolution is quite a successful theory. Also, philosophically, the principle of pragmatism that is built into behavioral analysis and then later contextual behavioral science. This also is quite evolutionary in nature, and so there's a nice parallel all the way through with pragmatism and evolution. And B.F. Skinner noticed this and emphasized this a lot, really bringing attention to this idea of the importance of selection by consequences. And this happens in three different levels. So phylogeny, so the evolutionary history of the species. So that is kind of the typical kind of biological evolution that we think about over time, species changing and being selected and having this long evolutionary history. So that's how we get diversity in species and in biological organisms. But also within the lifespan of individual biological organisms, there are developments of behaviors and other things. And that's ontogeny. So the development of the individual organism throughout their life, that is important. And finally, there's this cultural evolution level. So once we achieved this ability to do language and arbitrarily applicable relational responding, you start to see cultural practices that spread among groups that persist in time across and through the lifespan of different individuals. So selection by consequences happens at all of these levels. There's been explicit focus on evolutionary principles in CBS throughout as well. Part of this, I would say, has to do with some of the changes in what evolution science has focused on. So on the left, I'm just showing you the selfish gene, Richard Dawkins' book from 1976, which also is, by the way, where the term meme was first introduced. Um, but at that time in the 60s and the 70s, there was a lot of focus on sort of the gene-centric view. So there's a lot of focus on how do specific genes get replicated and build organisms so that those genes show up in the next generation. And there was a lot of skepticism and criticism of group selection models. So this idea that people would invest in their relatives, that there could be altruism between non-related individuals. That was kind of highly controversial in evolution science, and that has changed in the last 25 years or so. So there is more of a acceptance among some that there are group level effects. Evolution applies to the group and not just individual genes. So as evolution science becomes more open and they start to have these conversations with folks in CBS, we start to see a little bit more of consilience between those two. As an example, we see the pro-social. So pro-social is David Sloan Wilson, evolutionary scientist, talking to Steve Hayes and Paul Atkins and other folks, and trying to build a model of prosociality. So something that can be used in organizations and in groups. Similar, like using kind of some of this basic ideas of of CBS and ACT. And part of the interest in doing that was through the work of Eleanor Ostrom, Nobel Prize winner in economics. Her work really challenged the traditional view that people would just sort of not be able to use common resources. They would fight over them and they'd be overexploited or they'd be destroyed. She really found evidence that people could be kind of collectively caring for and nurturing these shared resources. And so the idea in pro-social is to take some of those principles that Ostrom identified and build those into group interventions to try to support this kind of pro-sociality in groups. So kind of this interesting blend of explicit evolutionary science mixed in with other fields. More explicit focus, there's a book length treatment of evolution in CBS with a lot of different topics in there, but asking some of the classic kind of evolutionary questions around, like, if we care about relational framing and it seems important, what were the evolutionary pressures that influenced the emergence of that? Um, the other one that we really see more applicable to clinical work is kind of reconceptualizing psychotherapy as an applied evolutionary science. And the way that we're doing that, or that folks have tried to do that, is to recast psychological suffering and flourishing in evolutionary terms, and then to think about what clinical intervention means from that perspective. So here are three kind of key evolutionary terms that you may see. And I've used both biological and behavioral examples to try to kind of get a feel for this. So variation is important. So in the biological context, we know that variations in DNA and gene expression create a variety of organisms or phenotypes, right? So DNA changes, it gets mixed up and recombined in sexual reproduction. It creates different individuals, right? And then we have selection pressures. So the environments create selection pressures that select which phenotypes are going to survive and reproduce, right? And so the biological example, you can think about like the butterflies, where some were really well suited in the industrial revolution when we had soot everywhere, and then some not. And so we have these big changes in environments that create different selection pressures and can influence which butterflies survive or not. And then we need a mechanism of retention. So if you have a successful, let's say, moth or butterfly, um, it's not, they're just going to die. And so there's no way to kind of go through time unless you have some mechanism to retain that. And in the biological example, that's DNA. So when you, like, part of what DNA is doing is it's surviving over time. So changes in DNA that survive selection pressure are retained and can pass on to the next generation. So we see these very old, kind of DNA motifs being conserved. So there needs to be a mechanism to retain um, successful things across time. If we bring this same kind of idea to behavior, so thinking about within the lifespan of an organism like a person, um, there can be variation. So people show different patterns of behavior, and those patterns could have extreme variability, right? Extreme variation. They could have limited variation, not much variation, and their pattern might evolve over time. So they might learn and do new things over time. So the variation changes as a function of time. We also have selection. So people exist in contexts that select which behaviors are going to successfully work for different purposes. It's a lot of what therapy and intervention is helping people find more workable behaviors to get the things that they want, right? To help a kid stop punching people and to use their words to successfully navigate the world and have access to more reinforcers and you know more opportunities in the world. That is a form of selection on behavior. But we also need retention. So we may help that kid in that moment use their words, but then we wonder, like, is that going to show up next week when they're back on the playground? Maybe, maybe not. So we also care about retention. So in behavior terms, we want to help build ways to sustain this, which we might think about as like habits. how do we build behaviors that over time are retained and grow? So there's this pretty direct kind of metaphorical comparison between biology and behavior using these terms that are like not so commonly used in traditional psychology, but really come from evolutionary science, right? So variation, selection, and retention. And so we're about to get to the EAM. There's a nice kind of bridging term that Steve Hayes has used, pronounced versatile. So we're going to take those three that we just talked about and put them together and talk about variation and retention of what is selected in context at the right dimension and level. And by level, we're talking about sort of within individuals, within groups, within families, recognition that we may need to care about just more than the individual, depending on what question we are trying to answer and what influence we're trying to have. And then dimension is basically talking about some of the different categories that have been sort of studied and identified in psychology, not in a mechanistic sense of like these are the true categories, but just more recognition that like it does seem that it's useful to distinguish like the dimensions of self from cognition, from affect, from motivation and overt behavior. So those are some of the different dimensions that have historically been important and that have been studied, and so we want to consider those, but then using the principles of variation, retention, and selection to think about what this means for psychological suffering or psychological flourishing. So what Steve has done is made this model, the EAM, Evolutionary Extended Meta Model. We call it a meta model because it has these different dimensions, and it's meant to kind of capture all of the different things that we might see in different therapy traditions. But it is not itself a model of therapy. It's meant to be sort of a way to organize and talk about things that we might see in different traditions or different therapies. We see a mapping here, so we see those dimensions in the EAM, and then we see a mapping here of common ACT terms and processes. So flexible perspective, taking self as context, applicable to the dimension of self. Um, Attentional flexibility touches the attention definition. Behavioral flexibility, values-based action, habits touches the dimension of overt behavior. So the idea here is that we could use the EAM to organize what we see happening in the system to talk about kind of in a functional way what we think the person is struggling with and what might be successful working for them, and then to try to map that onto intervention things that we know how to do from ACT or any other tradition that essentially are useful for specifically um, moving the process in the dimension that we think is relevant. So where do we stand with all of this? Ultimately, that critical reflection on the status of evolutionary theory, I'll leave that to you. I'll have to dive in pretty deeply and sort of see what you think. What I can say generally is right now in 2026, it's not yet clear if explicit training in this kind of evolutionary epistemology, these evolutionary definitions, or these specific kind of models, we don't know if that's really improving practice, if that's really kind of a good use of clinicians' time. But I would say for me, it's almost like a confidence interval in statistics. So right now, the confidence interval like it overlaps zero, so we can't kind of definitively rule it out. But I think it's moving towards maybe being useful. So we are seeing like potentially a future where some of this stuff really is going to be important for practitioners to know and do. Right now, I think we see these leading edge developments like in process-based therapy that potentially going to transform practice without requiring kind of deep knowledge of evolutionary science. So it might be that if you're building those models and you're building out the training and the use of them, that you're going to need to really know those things. But it could be that we would have sort of a a technology or a practice later that folks could use quite well, without knowing that. I guess the metaphor I would give of like being like like a flight controller, right? Flight controllers really do a good job of like getting planes safely, to where they need to go. Those folks don't necessarily have to be experts in physics. They don't have to know, Bernoulli's principle really well. But the systems that they build have to be grounded in the right place. So if you build good systems, potentially, you can get some of the benefits of recasting psychology into these evolutionary terms. And it's unclear yet whether or not that means that folks have to be themselves sort of experts in understanding that kind of evolutionary epistemology and those evolutionary terms. Okay, so this one is understanding and critical reflection on the development of CBS aligned therapies and innovations. So things like PBT, Knowledge Standard 10. So kind of picking up where we were with the EAM. So the evolutionary extended meta model, I don't think I mentioned, it's usually called the EAM. That is a meta model, not a model itself, as we said. And that is really informing what Hayes and Hoffman have proposed as process-based therapy. So you'll see it called PBT. There's some active kind of debate in the field about this and what it should be called. Many people are kind of thinking that this is probably better called a process-based approach, because if you call it PBT, it can make people think that it really is a kind of therapy itself. The process-based approach is there to remind us that this is a different way to think about therapy, but not a new therapy itself. And so what Steve Hayes has called for is kind of an open agora, aka a marketplace, where all interventions and all potential mechanisms of change are welcome to be considered, but they're all going to need to bring good evidence to remain. So it's not going to be enough for people to go like, here, here's just this intervention that I do, or here's one that I like. At some point, we're going to need to say, if you want to be considered kind of in the basic armamentarium of evidence-based practice, you need to bring some data about outcomes. You need to bring some data about mechanisms of change. Otherwise, just being a therapy itself isn't going to be a reason. So we don't want eclecticism. We're trying to increase the predictability of evidence-based practice, but also be open to not picking and choosing kind of which therapies or which approaches are there. Anybody can bring data, and the EAM and these sort of statistical methods that go along in evaluating this can help us know which pieces of the different methods and approaches really are showing promise in affecting change, and they're all welcome. And as practitioners, then we can be good consumers of those different methods and approaches, and not kind of just jump to eclecticism. So some of the recent directions or just some of the trends in CBS that would be important to know. So I think that this call from Hayes and Hoffman and others to end the era of protocols for syndromes. So this idea that a lot of the focus in like the 80s and 90s was randomized control trials for a specific kind of DSM symptoms. There was a lot of thought that these diagnoses were going to be supported by biological markers and really kind of strongly supported. That hasn't been the case. So there's criticism of DSM-based diagnoses is not particularly scientifically valid based on the way they identify them, or the clinical utility of knowing someone meets criteria for DSM depression doesn't say terribly a lot about what we need to do in treatment. And so really kind of moving beyond that to a process-based approach. Um, You'll see different terms for that, processes of change and all those things. I think the thing to bring us back to that functional root is this idea of the word process means things that sort of unfold in a sequence. We're really interested in trying to understand what are the specific sequences that lead to psychological maladaptive functioning, and what are the sequences that lead to flourishing or better functioning. And then how do we enact those? In other words, what are the methods that we can use to try to reliably create sequences that are important? And so that's what we mean by process-based approach, to think about those sequences and to use this kind of functional grounding, really paying attention to the antecedent and consequences to help us understand what those sequences are and where we want to intervene. And so folks may be familiar with this call from Gordon Paul in 1969, what treatment by whom is most effective for this individual with that specific problem, under which sets of circumstances, and how does it come about? And the call from Hayes and Hoffman with PBT is basically a modern version of this same question, but less focused on like which specific treatment in terms of kind of topographic definition, and more about these core biopsychosocial processes. So, what are the core biopsychosocial processes that should be targeted with this specific client, given their specific goal and the specific context they're in? And how can those core processes most efficiently and effectively be changed? So, how do we efficiently and effectively target them? That is the question that PBT raises and is starting to provide initial answers to. Another important kind of trend that you'll see in CBS is criticism of traditional psychometric measures. So the things that you might be more used to in routine psychotherapy practice. And the idea here is that a lot of these measures were derived from just pooling, groups of people and norming them on large groups of people. And when you do that, that has important limitations. One of the biggest limitations it has is individuals, people are complicated. We know that. Um, but the statistical assumption that goes into a lot of these group approaches is a fancy word from physics called ergodicity. And basically, ergodicity is this idea that, like, if you're going to take a group measure and apply it to the individuals, you have to make the assumption that all the individuals are kind of impacted the same way by the kind of overall processes. So they're kind of like, um, you can kind of substitute one for the other, or you can assume that what applies to one applies to the other. And when that doesn't hold, if ergodicity doesn't hold, then you can't then make strong conclusions of things that you see at the group level being relevant to the individual units, so that constitute the group. What this means for people is, if the same kind of psychological processes that are being measured at the group level, if they don't work the same way, if they aren't unfolding the same way among individuals, then group measures are going to be fundamentally flawed. They're just never going to catch it. And so they're going to be of limited use to that. The other problem with that level is, when you model things at the group, you're estimating parameters like average, right, or standard deviation. And when you do that, you then treat individuals as error terms, right? So people that are far away from the mean have a bigger error term, right? They're more of an outlier. And that isn't necessarily problematic, as long as you are sort of recognizing the limitations of these group type of measures. But historically, this approach comes from a pretty stigmatizing place. So making these kind of group norms and then making treatment decisions or policy decisions based on group averages and then people's deviations from those averages, that stigmatized and disempowered a lot of individuals. So people have been hurt by this, in the case of like eugenics, and they've also been passively hurt because uh, when when you don't recognize individual variation and you don't build your interventions around individual variation, you just kind of leave people alone, right? You build things where you're like, hey, this works for like 50% of the people. That's great. But then the other 50%, you say, well, they don't fit in. They're too far. They don't respond to this. But you don't build anything for them. So individuals are getting lost in that. And so big focus in CBS is to recognize the limitations of these traditional psychometric measures that have been normed on groups, and really move to a more uh, idiographic, individual-based approach. And key terms here that you'll see, um, so that kind of group approach, so principles that are derived from or applicable to groups, are called nomothetic principles. Principles that are derived from and applicable to individuals are called idiographic, and those terms have been around for a long time and used in different used in different contexts. And so what Hayes and Hoffman and others are trying to do is combine these in a useful way, what they call idionomic analysis. And what they're doing is they start by intensively modeling an individual, really trying to get that idiographic model of an individual. And then they might consider, because there might be times when you see individuals responding in similar ways, and you could group them together. And they are doing that. They are moving to kind of that nomothetic place. If when they put them together in that group, it gives them an improvement in their model over the individual model. If it makes it worse, then they don't want to group them. They'll leave it at the idiographic level. So over time, the hope is to model a lot of individuals and see where there might be places where it makes sense scientifically and statistically to bring them together and consider them nomothetic. So we want nomothetic principles. It's nice to have principles that apply to a larger um, variety of folks and situations. But the idea here is we want to build it from the ground up and make sure that we don't violate um, any of the models that represent the individual variation that we might see. So in general, then, psychological suffering or flourishing is conceptualized as a complex dynamic network. And what we're doing in idionomic analyses is trying to get a measure of those networks. That typically requires quite intensive longitudinal data. So we might need like 70 data points to estimate the connections between these different parts of the network. Not something that you can do with just kind of a pre, mid, post, uh, measure on a standard psychometric um, assessment. So quite intensive data collection. Right now, there's a lot of kind of clinician guided selection of that initial network, figuring out what things you think are in the network and choosing the items that you're going to use to measure that so that you can see the connections and see the network kind of get built. And it requires specialized statistical analyses to estimate this, to do this beyond more of just a kind of paper and pencil kind of reasoning. So there are some sophisticated statistical methods that are showing some promise. Right now, these are kind of limited in accessibility. So there are commercial uh, inaccessibly programs like through PsychFlex where you can even do this today. So you can join that. But to date, these aren't kind of widely available. And we're not sure yet what it's going to take to move these into routine practice. And there's some debate in the field about kind of the relative value of building these networks versus sticking with a kind of more traditional functional assessment based on clinical interviews. So it's an active area of research, and I think we are all kind of watching to see um, where it's going to pay dividends, and so there's a lot more you can read if you're interested in learning about this idionomic analysis. I wanted to share one clinical example of this idionomic approach, just so folks could see how it might be relevant to the clinical work that they are doing. Um, this is a kind of a common plot that you'll see in some of the idionomic papers, um, using kind of a fancy statistical procedure to come up with this estimate of, in this case, the relationship between low mindfulness and negative affect. So, kind of intuitively, I think people recognize that sometimes when people struggle with negative affect, so a lot of kind of depressed, sad kind of affect, part of what might be going on there is that they have kind of low use of mindfulness. They're not often kind of aware or checking in, using mindfulness sort of skills to notice some of the variations in their affect. And so there might be some kind of interesting link between folks with low mindfulness and negative affect. And in a kind of average sense, that seems to be true. So what you're seeing here is those horizontal lines are specific individuals. So they measured a good number of individuals here, this relationship between low mindfulness and negative affect, and then they plotted that. So if there's no relationship, it should be 0. If there's a negative relationship, it'll be to the left. And if it's a positive relationship, meaning there's some correlation between low mindfulness and negative affect, it'll be to the right, and it won't overlap with the 0 line. So what you see here is that little triangle between 0 and 0.5, right? That's representing the group average. So on average, in this group, we find that that this is true. The group, there is a relationship between low mindfulness and negative affect. But when we look at the individual results, we see it varies quite a bit. So if you look at the starting at the top right down, there's a good number of individuals whose lines don't cross 0. So these are folks that if we sort of knew this about them, we might think, yes, like maybe intentionally targeting mindfulness could be useful for them, particularly if their negative affect seems to be contributing in an important way um, to the overall network and contributing to the psychological suffering. But we also see a good number of individuals that their line crosses the 0. So there isn't necessarily kind of a strength of a relationship here. And so what that means is we might think, oh, mindfulness is good for everybody. This will be really great for them. But it won't necessarily have an impact, at least not on the negative affect part of their network. And so in that case, it might be sort of a non-response that we would think that they would respond because on average people do, but they're non-responders. And then there are folks on the left that are not showing this. They're showing kind of the opposite um, pattern, and we don't know yet because we don't have their whole kind of network. But what this might mean is we might be identifying folks where like uh, mindfulness is kind of not the thing to do. It might actually be iatrogenic or harmful. So this idea that like many people will benefit from a particular intervention, some won't, and some might be harmed. Um, that right, that's clinical intuition. As therapists, we know that, and we try to figure that out as we observe. But the idea of the idionomic analysis here is to say, let's not have that be just based on clinical kind of intuition. Let's have that be guided by data, and if we can find people that would really benefit from mindfulness, let's find that out and then offer them mindfulness. If we've got folks where it's inert or harmful, we're going to avoid that and try to find out other parts of the network that would be more important to impact, and maybe have a different treatment approach to them to make sure that we don't uh, kind of waste time or harm them by focusing on mindfulness if it's not going to be useful for them. All right, understanding the wide range of empirically supported principles and processes. So we can use kind of the PBT, the process-based approach, EAM as one kind of answer to this. A couple of books that have unpacked this. So there was process-based CBT and learning process-based therapy. Um, what you see there are a number of kind of treatment kernels, the parts of treatment that seem to be shared across a number of studies that actually kind of move these core biopsychosocial processes. So the process-based CBT book was sort of saying these are all the kinds of things that folks need to do. So it was things like cognitive restructuring, cognitive diffusion, behavioral activation, the things that had shown reliably are important. And then under that umbrella, those are the kinds of skills that all CBT therapists or all kind of process-based approach therapists should learn how to use and then apply as applicable. Also showing here the figure from this 2022 paper where they went through and they looked in the literature at mediators. So mediators are it's a little more technical and a stronger kind of interpretation we can use there than correlation. So these are things that are not just correlated with potential change, but statistically are controlled a little bit, where we think that these might be the processes that actually carry the change when we see positive outcomes in psychological intervention. They reviewed 55,000 of them, and they looked to see which ones had at least two separate studies that used this mediation analysis, and then they looked to see like what what fell out. And this is where you start to see what things are positively contributing to psychological outcomes. You see psychological flexibility other than mindfulness. There were a lot of ACT studies that were already using mediation in there, so they ended up surviving and taking up a big percentage of the findings. But you see things from outside of ACT, self-compassion and um, social support, loneliness. You also see some of the variations in like brain structure that aren't typically looked at in ACT. So you see this wide variety of mediators, and the idea is that this is helping us identify all of those potential kind of core biopsychosocial um, processes, and then um, specific kind of intervention uh, protocols that we could use to target them. Just as an example of what this might look like, this is just from the Learning PBT book. Um, so you have the different kind of treatment kernels, the things that would show up in that list of the core skills of a PBT or CBT therapist. So like exposure, cognitive diffusion, experiential acceptance. Those are all potential treatment kernels. As you make your functional analysis of the specific case and you start to understand where the network might be might be right for intervening, you can then think about sort of your targets. What part of the network are you targeting? And then can you link that up to a specific treatment kernel? So if exposure is important, you can think about the specific kind of exposure that you want to target, and then you can know that that is part of the treatment kernel of exposure. So all the skill and knowledge you have around doing exposure can be used to focus on that target. And you can also think about making some priorities about kind of the likelihood of success. So different clients, different networks, they may both benefit from exposure, but in different cases, you might judge exposure as more or less likely for that particular client at that time. Knowledge Standard 12, understanding context-specific variations in CBS knowledge to adapt to specific socio-political contexts. Again, it's also something that is there's a lot of literature about that. There, you could take entire courses on that. You know, you want to use implementation science. You want to use participatory designs. You want to talk to your consumers and adapt to them. Like those general principles are all going to apply. So here, just to give you a feel for what this looks like, just wanted to give some examples of some of the modifications, the contextual adaptations that we see in CBS. So we have upper left, we have Louise Hayes and Joe Cherokee DNAV model. So this was a model for teens, young folks, and um, kind of based on ACT, but also kind of going back to basics. Also add in a lot of positive psychology focus for teens. So not just a retread of ACT, but trying to build something from the ground up using what is in ACT and positive psychology that would be applicable for teens. And there are now some evaluation studies of DNAV, and it is proving useful. Similarly, we've got Russ Harris adapted ACT for use in global contexts by laypersons. So this is used across the world in settings like refugee camps where there may not be enough mental health professionals. So lay folks are guided by these. By this publication, Doing What Matters, to deliver like a brief 5-session intervention for folks in the refugee camp or in whatever setting they're in. And the language is adapted to be non technical to fit what would make sense for folks, and be accessible for someone who's a layperson who doesn't have the full training in mental health to deliver quite quickly. And there are some cool studies showing that that is also useful for folks in their future mental health. Dr. Jennifer Shepard Payne has a model of ACT specifically for African Americans, calling pulling out of the fire, or poof. Um, Redefining the language of the hexaflex to be more accessible uh, to that population. And I've heard her talk about how there's a more explicit uh, uh, appeal to religious and Christian um, scriptures and traditions that might be more common in that population. So, adapting the model to kind of fit to the specific cultural context of African Americans who have a Christian tradition, um, and yet not losing the basic kind of functional properties of promoting psychological flexibility. So these are just some of the examples of the adaptations that have been done, and there's many more in process. All right. Knowledge Standard 13, awareness of the main methods of evidence-based assessment. Again, I just point you back to that kind of overview list from the Haynes paper. Most of those are going to be more behavioral in focus for CBS therapists. We've talked a little bit about those limitations of traditional psychometric measures, although we still can use them. We just need to understand the challenges and some of the assumptions that they bring in, and use them judiciously. And then to build awareness of some of the other methods that are maybe less familiar, um, ecological momentary assessment and idiographic functionally validated approaches that are better suited for capturing those individual patterns over time to be used in idiographic or idionomic analyses. Have just one slide for you on this. Is another big topic, but ecological momentary assessment, as it suggests, is meant to do assessment kind of in ecologically valid settings, so not just in the clinic, but in the person's life as it unfolds. So these are methods where you might be prompting people through wearables, watches, apps on their phone, or collecting daily diary data. So throughout the day, sort of pinging them and saying, "Hey, give me a rating on, how present are you right now? How much are you aware of what you care about?" Those items vary a lot by the particular focus that you have. They typically are like short, like so, like 1 to 5 items. They're not doing a full scale at that moment, but you're getting data a lot more often. So every day or multiple times a day, so that you can start to build those networks of how these symptoms or how these processes that you're measuring, how they link up together. So you can build different networks if you take more longitudinally dense measurements through ecological momentary assessment methods. Similarly, the idiographic functional approaches, um, the sort of less technical versions are like self or other reported overt behaviors of interest. So you can have somebody just rate overt behaviors throughout the day more often, noticing when they are, the contextual factors that make the behavior more or less likely to happen. So folks could do self-report or other report collateral report of behavior over time. They might notice kind of episodes of anger, and start to note some of the contextual factors that seem to make them better or worse. You can also combine some of these idiographic functional approaches with some of the more data-driven ecological momentary assessment methods. So in PBT, often what they're using is a process-based assessment tool. And so this isn't like a standard psychometric, like everybody gets the same questions and there are sort of group norms, but more like you pick items that seem relevant to measure things in the network that you assume and that would measure the outcomes or processes that you're targeting. And then you measure them over and over and then subject them to the statistical analysis to see if they do kind of line up in sensible ways, and then to maybe see if they change in response to specific interventions. So um, kind of the full range of kind of pen and pencil type paper assessments, all the way up to kind of intense longitudinal data. But the key thing there is to recognize that these are things that are trying to get at some of those antecedent and consequential impacts of behavior, and not just kind of a decontextualized snapshot of the frequency of a particular behavior or a particular symptom. All right, knowledge standard 14, awareness of structured assessments of CBS related principles, such as standardized self-report measures of CBS processes. So do we have standardized measures? We have some in the CBS model, so that is good for you to know. All those reflection things about, you know, ideographic versus nomothetic measures still apply. But I just want folks to know that there are some specific ones. I would point folks to the contextual science page. There are these assessment measures, dedicated pages, and then broken down by individual therapy interventions. In our clinic, when we were focusing on ACT, we made a kind of an overview document where we collected references to a number of ACT measures and kind of related measures like self-compassion. And we organize these under kind of overall psychological flexibility. So there are some measures that take kind of a more global view of psychological flexibility, like the compact. And then there are ACT process specific ones, so that might target specific problems, like in the case of fusion. So the cognitive fusion questionnaire is commonly used, or on the flip side, a measure of diffusion, more kind of functional, the Drexel diffusion scale. So different measures with different, psychometric properties, different uses, and um, encouraging folks to use measurement to guide treatment, but also understanding that the selection of measures is sort of not is not a recipe. You have to think about your particular client and their particular needs and what you're focusing on in treatment, and then deciding which kind of measures would be most helpful for you. But there are measures specific to CBS therapy, so check them out. Also, the call there is not just to measure the processes for the client, but also to be caring about therapist quality of delivering interventions with fidelity and competency. And so the ACBS competency and dissemination pillar has organized the resources that exist to measure therapist competency in various CBS therapies. So I would also encourage folks to go there and become familiar with the competency measures in the CBS interventions that you are learning and using. And then finally, we made it, Knowledge Standard 15, working understanding of how to use single case experimental designs in clinical practice, with the idea that we want to invite people to practitioners to contribute to the evidence base. Practice-based research is important. Um, Again, this is something that you can long books about this. You can take whole classes on this. A lot to learn. My recommendation is really to start with finding studies that you like or that are similar to the ones that you would want to do. So go to JCBS, Journal of Contextual Behavioral Science there, see if there's a study that you like. Dig into that. Look at some of the other behavior journals, see if you find other studies. So dig into the methods if you're not familiar with them, and start to ask, like, my routine clinical practice, how aligned is it with this kind of approach? What would I need to do to really be measuring things from this kind of ethnographic perspective that we would want to see in single case experimental design? I thought it might be fun just to wrap up with walking through one example just to show you some of the things that you might see in these kind of papers. So this does come from JCBS a few years ago, where there's going to be a compassion-focused acceptance and commitment therapy intervention with women who have restrictive eating and problematic body checking. And it is a multiple baseline across participants design. So we're going to have 3 participants, and we're going to look pretty intensely at those participants to see what the intervention does. Just for the sake of size and things like that, I'm not showing you anything from participant 1, just talking about participant 2 and 3 here. You can see the case details of participant 2 and 3, 2-year-old women. with different kinds of body checking and restrictive eating body image concerns. The intervention is meant to be somewhat similar across participants, although it is contextualized to specific individuals and sort of varies a little bit by session. But briefly, it is informed by the Standard Act book from 99 and the anorexia workbook. It was delivered as 10 15-minute individual therapy sessions by one therapist, some common session structure of brief mindfulness, checking in, um, agenda items, homework, experiential exercises, and then the sessions are roughly kind of similar, kind of moving from basic therapeutic establishment of goals to going into that kind of creative hopelessness, moving towards acceptance, promoting openness, moving in towards engagement in valued living, and then self-compassion activities were kind of distributed throughout. So self-compassion was pretty actively targeted throughout the 10 sessions. And then this plot of results, this may look a little bit different than like the group designs that folks may be familiar with or those tables. This is what we commonly see if we're reporting kind of individual case data. You'll see this dotted line going throughout. The dotted line represents the transition from baseline data collection to intervention. So when we're doing single case, we don't always randomize people. Sometimes we do, but a lot of times we just ask people to serve as their own control. So in this case, we want a clear baseline. We want kind of data that's not moving around at baseline, so that when we move to intervention, we expect to see, a change that we can reliably ascribe to the intervention itself. So when we have enough baseline data depends a little bit on the individual participants. And so when we switch from baseline to intervention, it can vary. And so that's what you see the line varying between participant 2 and participant 3. The other thing you see here that is kind of characteristic of these idiographic single case designs is that even though we are kind of calling this similar behaviors across participants, restriction and body checking, how that is defined is idiographic. So for participant 2, they're defining restriction as avoiding eating around others because of embarrassment, avoiding eating when hungry, or limiting the amount of food eaten to avoid feeling full. But for the other participant, for number 3, their definition is more focused on eating pure or clean foods. So um, um, focusing on foods with low fat or low calorie content, um, or eating a kind of an unbalanced diet. So even though it's kind of similar, it is idiographically defined. It's going to be more meaningful for participant 2 and participant 3 rather than some kind of a priori decision about what constitutes restricted or eating. And you can see the same kind of definition. So with body checking, that it varies between participant 2 and participant 3. So these behaviors that they're measuring are quite personally important to folks. That seem to be what they specifically want help with. And then you'll notice that there are a number of measures. So we've got a lot of data points here. Looks like we're measuring kind of every day, mostly. And we do intervention for a while, and then there's a break, and then there's a follow-up around day 90. So you can see that we need this more dense longitudinal measurement. I think this is self-reported tracking. You could do this differently with ecological momentary assessment and get even potentially more than one reading a day if you wanted to. I think another aspect that is cool in this study is that we're interested in, of course, flourishing and vital living, not just symptom reduction. So, in the past figure, we were looking at some of those overt behaviors that are really important to target, that may be causing suffering. But we also want to see if over time we can transform this and increase folks' valued living. And so each participant was given a chance to identify a meaningful values-based behavior that they wanted to target and see changed. So participant 2 chooses social withdrawal. She's sort of defining it negatively. It's easier for her to see withdrawal than it is to see the kind of engagement she wants. So she is targeting withdrawal, but of course the idea is that the withdrawal becomes less common and the kind of engagement that she wants becomes more common. So we have choice about how we frame that, but essentially it's she wants more kind of positive social engagement. And participant two wants to wear clothes that are more, her choice is more governed by her values and caring about herself, and not so much governed maybe by sort of social pressure. So each one gets to measure what they want, and you get to see sort of the baseline and how it responds after the intervention and at follow up. And we see like participant three has a pretty consistent um, pattern of valued behavior that does persist beyond the intervention on to day 90. There were also some traditional psychometric measures that were used. These are kind of focused more specifically to the clinical issue at hand. So there is a version of the AAQ from ACT, the Body Image Acceptance and Action Questionnaire, 12-item self-report measure. You can see that it was only used once at baseline, and then an intervention is being used. Looks like maybe every week or so. So kind of a routine check in on that. That's helpful too, to see if those measures are telling the same story as the overt behavioral measures that we saw in the other figures. So we have that for body image flexibility, and we also have that for self-compassion. So you can see, for example, that for self-compassion, some evidence that seems to be growing for participant two, and not so much for participant three. Participant three seems to be pretty consistently rating self-compassion before and after the intervention. So that's not changing, but they are showing improvement on the body image AAQ. So you start to see the individual changes in the cases. And if you think about this, working with this clinically, it helps you know. So there's different things that you might do with participant two versus participant three. Participant three, we might want to check in and see if that self-compassion is still kind of problematic, and maybe do a more targeted intervention to try to increase self-compassion ratings on the scale, and maybe self-compassion overt behaviors. And then if we look at some of the kind of pre-post outcomes, these also are important. So on kind of standardized measures of the restricting and the body checking, we see that these do kind of move in the desirable way from pre to post to that 90-day follow-up. So we can see some improvements in restricting and body checking. We can see that we can quantify the effect of the values-based action that each one chooses. We can see the overall pattern of improvement in body image or self-compassion if it's there. We can compare this to kind of general psychological distress, so we can make sure that we're targeting those things, and identify if there might be other areas of distress that are in need of further attention. And because this was focused on body image and weight, they also wanted to show kind of what happened with weight. So if we put all these findings together, it's pretty cool. We can kind of answer this question of like, does this compassion focus act 10 session protocol seem to be useful? Yeah, it seems to be useful for these three participants. Not on every measure, but on some of the key ones. So it's promising, right? Um, it helps kind of guide individual intervention. So if that, if you were the therapist for participant three, um, you know, that would inform you about where you need to go next, and you'd be guided by that data much more than just kind of a pre-post psychometric measure. Um, and if you were developing something new, so if this was like a new version of, compassion focused act, this would give you kind of tentative early, belief that like you might be onto something, and you might start thinking about bringing this up to like a larger number of participants. You might start thinking about whether you could shorten it, make it more effective. You might start thinking about whether you need to tailor to maybe some folks like participant three really do struggle with self-compassion, and the intervention doesn't quite move it, and so they might need an extra dose of that. So you'd start to kind of contextualize your intervention. And if you were able to to publish this, you can be in conversation with researchers and other practitioners. And even though you might not be in a spot to do, a large randomized controlled trial, you're contributing to the evidence base. You're helping people think about how to contextualize their interventions and potentially inspiring something. So if this does look like a quite promising intervention that might be something to think about as like something to widely scale out, maybe there would be a researcher that would take this and would do an RCT and start to figure out kind of how applicable this is and start to do that. So that's the kind of cool thing that we can do with single case experimental design if we use the principles of functional analysis, and if we do the kind of data collection that is really grounded in these idiographic methods. So start there and then try to build to those more nomothetic group valid um, conclusions if we can. But even if we can't, this is really useful, and we see the clinical utility of this. It really helps us kind of know where we are, where to go in treatment, and to feel like we have met the standards of prediction and influence and functional contextualism. So that is our lightning quick tour of all of the knowledge standards left. Thank you all for listening, and I wish you well in your next learning journey. Thanks.